The only person who can save your fortune now is Naomi Carter. The sentence landed softly, but it still managed to hollow out the air in Richard Whitmore's chest. For a moment, he thought he had misheard the attorney. Men like Richard Whitmore did not get summoned. They did not sit in private conference rooms on the 42nd floor waiting for permission to enter. They owned the buildings, named the wings, decided who stayed and who disappeared. But this morning, under the pale Manhattan light bleeding through a wall of glass, Richard sat alone at the end of a walnut table polished so perfectly it reflected the silver in his hair like a fault line. A leather folder rested in front of him, unopened. Across the cover, embossed in understated black lettering, was a name he had not seen in years. Naomi Carter. Outside, late October rain streaked the windows in long gray threads, softening the skyline into something watercolor and distant. Inside, the room smelled faintly of espresso, paper, and expensive wood polish. Quiet hummed through the vents. Somewhere down the hall, heels clicked once, then faded. Richard kept his gaze on the folder, but his fingers had already begun to betray him. The right hand, the steady one, tapped once against the tabletop, then stopped when he noticed it. He folded both hands together. Stillness had always been one of his disciplines. He had built an empire on the appearance of control. Even when markets dipped, even when boards revolted, even when his own son had once called him emotionally bankrupt in a room full of trustees, Richard had maintained the look of a man who could outwait any storm. But this name, printed clean and small against dark leather, disturbed something he could not quite master. Naomi Carter. The syllables brought back not a face at first, but a room. A younger room. Brighter. Colder. Full of men who mistook confidence for intelligence, and women who had learned to survive by never speaking one sentence too many. He remembered a projector humming against a white screen. He remembered summer light on glass. He remembered an intern standing at the far end of a conference table, clutching a clicker in one hand and a stack of notes in the other, like both were heavier than they looked. Black blazer a little too thin for the over-air-conditioned room. Sensible. Shoes. Chin lifted higher than her age should have allowed. He had forgotten her face for years. But not the feeling. The feeling of amusement. The easy, practiced dismissal. The little smile he had worn when she started talking about legacy investing, as if she had discovered some hidden truth no one else in finance had ever seen. The memory arrived sharper now. She had been young, very young, with the kind of voice that tried to stay calm even when the room wanted it to shake. She had spoken about neighborhoods no one in that room had ever lived in. About pension fragility. About long-term capital structures that didn't just protect wealth, but preserved it across generations that had never been invited into the conversation. She had spoken as if money carried moral weight, as if numbers could remember people. He remembered leaning back in his chair, remembered the low chuckle from someone near the window, remembered the way the room had already decided what she was before she reached her third slide. Then, like an old recording playing in perfect fidelity, he heard his own voice. Dreams are cheap. People like you should learn to survive before trying to lead. He had said it without raising his tone. That was the worst of it. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Just dropped into the room with the confidence of a man certain the world would arrange itself around his judgment. He could still see what followed. Not a scene. Not tears. Not outrage. Naomi Carter had gone very still. That was all. The kind of stillness that made the room feel briefly ashamed of itself, though no one there would have used that word. Her fingers tightened around her notes. Her eyes did not fall to the floor. They stayed on him for 1 second longer than comfort allowed, and in that second something unreadable had passed across her face. Not defeat. Not exactly. Something quieter. Colder. A promise, maybe. Or the birth of one. Richard had forgotten the rest of the meeting within an hour. Men in his position forgot small people every day. That was one of the hidden luxuries of power. To wound without carrying the bruise yourself. To move on while someone else built a life around a sentence you barely remembered saying. The door latch clicked softly behind him, pulling him back into the present. Richard looked up. The assistant standing there wore navy. Neat hair, neutral expression, the polished invisibility of elite firms everywhere. Miss Carter will see you now, Mr. Whitmore. Richard rose slowly, smoothing the front of his charcoal suit with a hand that no longer felt entirely like his own. On the other side of that door was not an intern. not a young woman with a borrowed blazer and a dream the room had laughed at. On the other side was the one person who now controlled whether the Whitmore fortune would remain a dynasty or become a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails downtown. He picked up nothing. Not the folder. Not his phone. Just himself. And for the first time in a very long time, that did not feel like enough. The corridor outside Naomi Carter's office was warmer than the conference room, but Richard Whitmore still felt cold. Not the ordinary kind of cold that lived in Manhattan rain or came from overworked office air conditioning. This was older than weather. It settled under the collar, beneath the ribs, in the thin hidden places where memory liked to wait until it could become useful. The assistant led him past framed abstracts in muted earth tones and a row of windows overlooking lower Manhattan. The city below looked small from this height, yellow cabs threading between blocks like toy pieces pushed by an invisible hand. Richard usually loved that view. Height had always comforted him. Distance had always made things feel manageable. Today it only made him aware of how far he had fallen from certainty. At the end of the corridor, the assistant stopped at a dark oak door with brushed brass hardware. There was no oversized nameplate, no theatrical display of status, no loud branding to announce power. Just a narrow strip of frosted glass and one line in understated lettering. Naomi Carter, Chief Executive Officer. The assistant gave a polite nod, then stepped aside. Richard opened the door himself. The office beyond was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not empty but composed. Floor-to-ceiling windows spread across the far wall, turning the rain into silver threads against a washed-out skyline. A cream rug softened the room. Shelves held books on finance, law, architecture, and public policy, their spines arranged without showiness, as if they had been chosen to be read rather than admired. Near the window stood a long table with neatly stacked binders, each tagged in pale gray tabs. No clutter, no wasted gesture. On one wall hung a large black and white photograph of a bus stop in the rain, an ordinary city moment captured with such stillness that Richard found himself staring at it before he even saw her. Naomi stood beside the window, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. She turned only after he entered fully, and for one suspended second the room seemed to tighten around the space between them. She was not smiling. She was not hard either. That was what unsettled him first. He had expected triumph, perhaps some carefully controlled satisfaction, maybe the faint edge of revenge. Instead, Naomi looked like a woman with too much to do to perform anyone's drama for them. Her charcoal suit was clean-lined and precise, the kind of tailoring that said confidence without waste. A thin gold watch flashed at her wrist when she moved. Her hair was pulled back simply. No excess, no distraction. But it was her face that stopped him. Time had refined it, not softened it. The uncertainty of youth was gone, replaced by something steadier than confidence and more dangerous than anger. Clarity. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk. Please sit. Her voice had changed less than he expected. It still carried that same quiet discipline, the same effortlessness that had once made a room of older people underestimate her. Richard sat. The leather chair gave beneath him with a faint sigh. Naomi remained standing for another beat, as if allowing the moment to settle into its natural shape before taking her own seat behind the desk. From there she opened a slim folder and glanced down, not because she needed to learn anything from it, but because she understood the power of measured pace. I understand your attorney explained the urgency, she said. Richard folded his hands again. He explained enough. Naomi looked up. Her gaze was level, unreadable. Then I will save us both time. Your family office is exposed on 3 fronts. Liquidity pressure, governance fracture, and a debt structure that should have been unwound 18 months ago. She slid one page across the desk. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just exact. Richard glanced at it and saw a chart, clean and ruthless, lines descending where he would have once insisted they would recover. You have controlling interests tied up in outdated vehicles, she continued. Your son challenged the trust language last spring. 2 board members have already begun quietly positioning for asset separation. And the private debt package your team believed was insulating you is doing the opposite. It is tightening. Richard kept his face composed, but the words landed with the dull, accumulating weight of wet concrete. He had known pieces of this. Not the architecture of it. Not the shape of the trap. Naomi folded her hands over the folder. To be clear, Mr. Whitmore, this is no longer a question of protecting returns. This is about whether your family keeps control of its future. Her office fell silent after that. Rain traced the glass. Somewhere below, a siren passed and faded. Richard looked at her fully now, at the woman who had once stood at the edge of his conference room, trying to speak hope into a room that only respected inheritance. "And you control the solution," he said. Naomi did not answer immediately. She reached for a pen, aligned it with the edge of her notebook, and only then met his eyes again. "No," she said softly. "I control whether there is still time for one." Richard let the silence sit between them, but silence had changed its allegiance in this room. Years ago, he had used it like a wall. A pause from him could shrink a junior analyst, flatten a competing voice, make an entire table lean unconsciously toward his approval. Here, across from Naomi Carter, silence did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to the woman who knew exactly how long to let a truth breathe before the other person understood there was nowhere left to hide from it. He looked down at the page she had slid across the desk. The numbers were clean, almost elegant in their cruelty. Lines moved downward in disciplined slopes. Dates sat in sharp little columns, each one a missed chance, a delayed decision, a fracture disguised at the time as strategy. He had seen countless reports in his life, but this one did not feel like analysis. It felt like a mirror held too close. "You are presenting the worst case," he said at last, keeping his tone even. Naomi tipped her head a fraction, not insulted, not defensive. "No," she said. "I am presenting the version of events that remains polite." The rain tapped softly against the glass behind her, thin and patient. Richard leaned back in the chair, though it gave him no comfort now. "My team has reviewed our exposure." "Your team created most of it," Naomi replied. She reached for another folder and opened it with the smooth economy of someone who respected precision more than performance. "You had 3 opportunities to restructure the debt package. Each time, your office delayed because the appearance of stability mattered more to you than the cost of maintenance." She slid another page forward. "That decision is why the trust is vulnerable now." Richard glanced at the paper without touching it. He did not like the way she said your office. Not accusatory. Worse. Accurate. "And my son?" he asked. Naomi's expression did not shift, but something in her eyes sharpened, as if she had expected him to arrive there eventually. "Your son challenged the trust language because the current structure limits his authority while exposing him to the outcome. He does not want stewardship without agency." Richard looked past her for a moment, toward the blurred silver of the skyline. Daniel had always mistaken impatience for modernity. Or maybe Richard had mistaken control for wisdom. Age did not improve a man as much as it repeated him. Naomi closed the folder. "This is the part where men in your position usually ask how much I know." Richard met her eyes again. "How much do you know?" For the first time, the faintest trace of something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not amusement. Recognition. "Enough," she said. "Enough to see the pattern. Enough to know your board has been speaking in 2 languages for over a year. One for you. One for each other. Enough to know the family office stopped protecting legacy and started protecting ego." The word should have angered him. In another room, from another person, they would have. But Naomi spoke with the steadiness of a surgeon naming what an image already showed. There was no malice in it. That was what made it cut deeper. Richard rose and walked toward the window before he could stop himself. 42 floors below, the city moved on schedule. Umbrellas bloomed along the sidewalks. A delivery truck edged through traffic. 2 people stood at a corner sharing space. Beneath a storefront awning, shoulders tucked in against the rain. Ordinary life. Small life. He had spent decades believing scale determined significance. Bigger deals. Bigger buildings. Bigger influence. But standing in Naomi Carter's office, with the wet gray city spread beneath him and his family empire reduced to tabbed binders on a table, Richard felt for the first time how fragile large things really were. "Why take this meeting?" he asked, still facing the glass. "You could have let the structure collapse. You could have watched it from a distance." Behind him, he heard the soft rustle of paper, then stillness again. "I do not build from distance," Naomi said. Her voice was calm, but there was history under it now, quiet and unmistakable. "And collapse is expensive. It hurts people who never made the decisions that caused it." Richard turned. She was watching him with the same controlled composure she had worn from the moment he entered, but now he could see something beneath it. Not anger, not pity, memory. He knew then that the past had not left this room for either of them. It had simply matured into different forms. For him, it had become consequence. For her, it had become authority. Naomi folded her hands on the desk. Before we discuss terms, she said, there is something you need to understand. This is not the first time you and I have sat across from each other while your future depended on whether you were willing to hear me. Richard did not move right away. The rain behind him had become finer now, less like weather and more like static on the glass. And the city below looked blurred at the edges, as if New York itself had decided not to interrupt what was happening in this room. He turned slowly back toward Naomi Carter and lowered himself into the chair again. Something in her last sentence had shifted the temperature. Until now, this had been a crisis meeting, a financial reckoning, a negotiation wrapped in polished language and expensive furniture. But with one calm line, Naomi had reached beneath the binders, beneath the legal structures and trust exposure and board politics, and laid a hand on the deeper thing underneath. Memory. Richard folded one leg over the other, more from habit than comfort. I remember the meeting, he said. Naomi watched him for a second, then leaned back slightly in her chair. Do you? Her voice was not sharp. That made the question more difficult to answer. Richard held her gaze. I remember enough. That has always been the privilege, she said softly. Enough. She stood then and crossed to the shelf near the window. The movement was unhurried, almost quiet enough to disappear into the room, but Richard tracked it anyway. She selected a thin black binder, returned to the desk, and laid it between them. The tab was marked with a date from nearly a decade ago. He felt something tighten low in his chest before she even opened it. Inside were photocopies of old presentation materials, intern assignment notes, meeting summaries, pages he had not thought about in years because men like him were trained to forget the scaffolding once the tower stood. Naomi turned one page toward him. The title at the top was simple, almost painfully young in its hope. Intergenerational Stability Through Community-Based Long Horizon Investment. Richard stared at it. The paper was ordinary, white, slightly softened at the corners from age and handling. But the words on it carried a kind of embarrassing innocence, the sort ambitious young people still allowed themselves before the world taught them how much laughter power could fit inside a boardroom. You kept this, he said. Naomi's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the binder. I kept all the things people told me were too small to matter. Richard glanced up at her, then back down. He could see notes in the margin, some typed, some handwritten. A few lines had been underlined. One section was marked with a paper clip that had left a pale rust shadow. This was an intern draft, he said, but even to his own ears the sentence sounded thinner than he intended. Naomi nodded once. Yes, it was. Then she turned another page. This one held a summary memo from the day of that meeting. Names listed in neat corporate font. Agenda points. Recommendations. A brief line item describing Naomi's proposal as aspirational but impractical. Another describing senior leadership response as dismissive. Richard read that word twice. Dismissive. Such a clean word for what had happened. So much damage could hide inside polite language. You documented it, he said. I survived it, Naomi replied. The room fell still again. Somewhere outside the office, an elevator chimed, distant and irrelevant. Richard looked at the old papers spread between them and began to understand that Naomi had not preserved them for revenge. Revenge would have required heat. This was colder than that. More disciplined. She had kept the evidence of who she had been before anyone believed her, because there was power in continuity, in refusing to let the world edit your beginning once it finally respected your ending. Why show me this now, he asked. Naomi clasped her hands loosely. Because men in crisis like to believe the present arrived out of nowhere. It comforts them. It turns consequence into bad luck. Her eyes stayed on his. I needed you to see that this did not begin with market pressure. It began in rooms where certain voices were treated as decorative until proven useful. Richard felt the truth of that more sharply than he wanted to. Not because he was ready to confess it. Not because redemption had suddenly come for him in a wash of understanding, but because the facts in front of him did not leave much room for self-flattery. Naomi had not merely returned successful. She had returned in possession of a longer memory than his own. He looked again at the first page, at the younger version of her thinking printed in black ink. There it was, unmistakable now. The architecture of what she had become. The logic, the patience, the moral frame around money that had once amused him because he had mistaken cynicism for sophistication. "You believed this back then," he said quietly. Naomi gave the slightest nod. "I did." Richard let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "And I laughed at it." Naomi did not rush to answer. She closed the binder gently, almost tenderly, and rested her palm on top of it. "No," she said. "You laughed at me. The idea survived just fine." For the first time since entering the office, Richard Whitmore did not have an immediate answer. Naomi's words remained between them with the clean weight of something undeniable. "You laughed at me. The idea survived just fine." It was not accusation dressed up as wisdom. It was simpler than that. It was a correction. A precise one. And like most precise things, it cut deeper because it did not need force. Richard looked down at the closed binder beneath Naomi's hand, then at the fine grain of the walnut desk, then finally back at her face. She was giving him no performance to react to, no anger to defend against, no cruelty he could use to make himself the wrong party. She had left him with nothing but proportion, and proportion was harder to fight than blame. Outside, the rain had eased into a silver mist that blurred the far buildings and turned the river into a strip of dull steel. The office lights had begun to glow more warmly against the gray afternoon, softening the edges of the room without softening what was being said inside it. Richard cleared his throat. "I was not the only one in that room." Naomi nodded once. "No, you were just the one everyone followed." The sentence landed harder than the others. Richard felt it in the same place where fatigue had been living for months now, deep under the ribs, where pride and age and pressure all started to sound alike. He leaned back in the chair and let his gaze drift briefly to the black and white photograph on the wall, the bus stop in the rain, two strangers standing close under a narrow awning, each holding their own weather without speaking. He wondered, absurdly, if Naomi had chosen it because it reminded her of being overlooked, or because it reminded her that small, ordinary moments were where people revealed themselves most honestly. "You think this is about one meeting," he said, though even as he spoke he knew she would hear the weakness in it. Naomi folded her hands together. "No, I think one meeting tells the truth about a culture faster than 10 annual reports." Richard almost smiled at that, but the expression never reached his mouth. She was right, and he hated how much he recognized the machinery once she named it plainly. The polished condescension. The way a room could turn against a person before they even finished a sentence. The way intelligence was often welcomed only after it arrived wearing the right family name, the right school, the right face. He had spent decades calling it standards. Efficiency. Fit. There were elegant words for every cruelty that wanted to survive in America while pretending it had evolved. Naomi opened another folder, this one thinner, and slid a single page toward him. It was not legal language this time. Not debt, exposure, or governance charts. It was a list of names. Interns, analysts, associates, dates beside them, duration of employment, reasons for departure. Richard frowned. "What is this?" "Your pattern," Naomi said. He looked more closely. Most of the names meant nothing to him, but the structure did. Hires brought in with bright credentials and narrow room to grow. People shuffled into support roles, passed over, praised for resilience instead of promoted for insight. A few names were marked with notes from exit interviews. Did not feel heard. No path to leadership. Repeated exclusion from decision-making spaces. Richard felt his jaw tighten. "You cannot pin an entire institution on me." Naomi's expression remained level. "I do not need to. Institutions learn from the people at the top. They study what gets rewarded. They imitate what gets ignored." Richard let the page rest on the desk. He thought of years of recruitment speeches, glossy brochures, smiling diversity panels, scholarships announced at dinners where no one had to look too closely at the executive floor the next morning. He had told himself those efforts mattered. Maybe they had, but not enough to interrupt the deeper current. Not enough to change what happened in rooms like the one Naomi had entered all those years ago with a clicker in her hand and an idea no one was willing to imagine coming from her. "And now?" he asked quietly. Naomi turned her chair a fraction toward the window, the city light catching the edge of her watch. Now I decide whether your family office gets rebuilt by someone who understands what legacy costs when it is confused with entitlement. Richard held her gaze. You want an apology? Naomi looked at him then, fully, and there was no triumph in her face, only a kind of tired clarity that made her seem older than him for one brief second. No, she said. I want accuracy. She let that settle, then continued in the same calm voice. An apology comforts the person who gives it. Accuracy changes the terms of what happens next. Richard looked away first. He was beginning to understand that this meeting was not going to be about humiliation returned. Naomi Carter was doing something harder than revenge. She was forcing him to stand still inside the truth long enough to see himself without the insulation of wealth, title, or habit. And the most unsettling part was that she was doing it with the same discipline he had once mistaken for weakness. Naomi let the silence rest one beat longer, then reached for the glass carafe at the corner of her desk and poured water into 2 short crystal tumblers. It was such a small gesture that Richard almost missed its meaning. Not hospitality exactly. Not softness. Something steadier. The kind of discipline that kept a room from turning into theater. She slid 1 glass across to him without a word. He looked at it for a moment, then took it. The water was cold enough to bead faintly against the glass, and when he drank, he realized how dry his throat had become. Outside the window, the rain had nearly stopped. The city was beginning to reassemble itself in the fading light, edges sharpening, windows catching dim reflections, the river beyond the buildings holding a strip of pewter-colored calm. Naomi sat back in her chair, hands loosely folded, waiting not like a victor, but like someone who had learned long ago that truth arrived on its own schedule. Richard set the glass down carefully. Accuracy, he repeated, as if testing the word for weight. Naomi gave a small nod. It matters. He looked at her for a long second. You think I never saw you clearly. I think you saw exactly what your world taught you to see, she said. A young black intern with an idea that sounded inconvenient in a room built by men who were paid to protect what already existed. The words were plain, almost gentle, but they left no room to step around them. Richard looked toward the shelves again, the books, the binders, the quiet order of the office. Everything here seemed earned. Not inherited. Not staged. Earned. That distinction had once seemed sentimental to him. Now it felt uncomfortably precise. You make it sound simple, he said. Naomi shook her head. It was never simple. That was the problem. She rose and moved toward the window, standing where the gray light caught the side of her face. People like to imagine bias as loud. Obvious. Something crude that can be denied by anyone wearing the right suit. But most of the damage does not announce itself. It arrives in tone, in who gets interrupted, in whose ideas become brilliant only after somebody else repeats them, in who is told to be patient while others are invited to lead. Richard listened without interrupting. Her reflection hovered faintly in the glass, layered over the city, as if the skyline itself had to make room for her now. Back then, she continued, I worked harder than everyone in that program because I knew I had less margin for being ordinary. I had to be sharper, calmer, more prepared, less emotional, more polished, less visible, and somehow more unforgettable at the same time. She turned then, one hand resting lightly against the window frame. Do you know what that does to a 22-year-old? Richard did not answer. He thought of his own beginning, summers in offices arranged by family friends, mistakes turned into lessons instead of conclusions, confidence treated as promise instead of arrogance. He had entered rooms already assumed to belong there. Naomi had entered knowing she would have to prove she deserved oxygen. No, he said at last, and the honesty of it surprised even him. Naomi studied him for a moment, then looked down at the street below. I used to rehearse before meetings, she said quietly. Not the analysis. The version of my face that would make people least comfortable dismissing me. Something tightened in Richard's chest. It was not pity. Naomi would have rejected pity on sight. It was the sharp, delayed recognition of a cost he had never once had to pay and had therefore never bothered to calculate. The office felt different now, less like a battlefield than a ledger opening line by line. Naomi returned to the desk and opened a smaller notebook, one with handwritten tabs and pages filled in dark ink. After that internship, she said, I took every job nobody glamorous wanted. Municipal bond cleanup, distressed housing portfolios, pension reconciliation, Work that looked small from the outside. She glanced up at him. Small work teaches you where the real fractures are. Richard said nothing. He was beginning to understand that her rise had not come from a miracle or a dramatic rescue. It had come from seeing what others overlooked because they were too proud to get close enough to learn from it. Naomi closed the notebook. You asked why I took this meeting. That is part of the answer. I know what collapse reaches first. It is never the people in penthouses. It is the employees whose names do not make the articles. The retirees whose checks come late. The assistants who get called loyal until the budget shifts. Her eyes held his again. I built my firm so that powerful people could not keep calling their negligent strategy. Richard lowered his gaze to the desk. The room had grown darker around the edges, and the first amber reflections from neighboring towers were beginning to glow in the glass. He could feel something inside himself resisting and yielding at the same time, old instincts still searching for a cleaner version of the story, while the truth kept refusing simplification. You still believe money should serve people, he said. Naomi's expression softened by the smallest degree, not into warmth exactly, but into recognition. I always did. Richard looked at the half-empty water glass beside his hand, then back at the woman across from him. And I taught you what happens when it does not. Naomi did not answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, like something set down with care. No, Richard. The world taught me that long before you. You were just one of the men confident enough to say it out loud. Richard let her last sentence settle without trying to defend himself from it. There was a strange exhaustion in being seen accurately after a lifetime of being deferred to. Not physically exhausting, though he felt that too now in the stiffness across his shoulders and the dull pulse at his temples, but morally exhausting. The way truth could drain a room of every decorative lie a person had used to soften himself. He looked at Naomi across the desk and understood, maybe for the first time, that what unsettled him most was not her success. It was the integrity of it. She had become powerful without resembling the people who had once stood in her way. She had not borrowed their cruelty to prove she belonged among them. She had built something cleaner, and that left him nowhere to place his old excuses. The office had grown darker, the late afternoon fading into the blue-gray hour when Manhattan began turning on its lights one floor at a time. Reflections rose in the windows now, faint doubles of the room floating over the skyline. Naomi reached to the side table and switched on a lamp with a linen shade. Warm light spread over the desk, catching the edges of the folders and softening the shadows beneath Richard's hands. It changed the mood of the room in an instant. Not gentler exactly, more intimate. The kind of light in which people either told the truth or became very aware that they were not. Naomi sat again, but this time she did not open another file. She simply regarded him with that same composed patience that had begun to feel less like strategy and more like character. There is one more thing you need to understand before we discuss terms, she said. Richard nodded once. He no longer trusted his own voice to sound as controlled as he wanted. Naomi glanced briefly toward the black and white photograph on the wall, then back to him. When people tell these stories later, they usually tell them backward. They start with the successful version of someone and pretend the outcome was inevitable. Her fingers rested lightly on the arm of the chair. It was not inevitable. There were years when I was tired enough to almost agree with rooms like yours. Richard felt something in that sentence that had not been present before. Not weakness. Cost. The kind that did not advertise itself. He said nothing. Naomi continued in a tone so even that it made the words land harder. After I left your internship, I spent almost a year interviewing for roles I was clearly qualified for and being told I was impressive but not quite the right fit. I learned how many ways a door could stay closed while still sounding polite. She looked down for one brief moment, as if seeing not the office around her, but some older version of a waiting area, fluorescent lit and chilled, where ambition sat straight-backed and tried not to look discouraged. I took contract work no one wanted because it paid by the hour and because nobody glamorous cared enough to gatekeep it. I worked in borrowed cubicles. I rode buses home with takeout coffee gone cold in my bag. I called my mother from laundromats because that was the only place quiet enough to hear myself think. The room stayed still around her words. Richard could almost see it now, the life that had existed completely outside his line of sight while he moved between board dinners and charity galas, believing the world was largely a Meritocracy because it had never demanded much imagination from him. Did you ever think about quitting? He asked, the question leaving him before he decided whether he had the right to ask it. Naomi did not seem offended. She considered it honestly. Not in one dramatic moment, she said. That is not how it happens for most people. It happens in smaller ways. You stop volunteering an idea. You stop picturing yourself at the head of the table. You become grateful just to remain in the room. Richard lowered his eyes. He knew enough now to hear the grief hidden inside that last sentence. The grief of self-reduction, of being trained to call survival wisdom. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter now. I promised myself I would never build a place where talented people had to become smaller in order to be considered safe. Richard looked up. And did you keep that promise? It was the first question he had asked all afternoon that did not contain defense inside it. Naomi seemed to hear that. Something almost tender crossed her face, there and gone. I tried, she said. Some days better than others. Power tests everyone. The honesty of that struck him unexpectedly. She was not painting herself pure. She was naming the burden of stewardship as carefully as she had named his failures. It made her seem even more formidable. Richard sat back and let out a slow breath. Below them, headlights had begun moving in white and red ribbons through the streets. Somewhere in the building, a distant burst of laughter rose and faded. Life continued, indifferent and exact. You said rooms like mine almost changed how you saw yourself, he said. Naomi held his gaze. For a while they did. Her voice remained calm, but there was an old ache under it now, finally contained. That is what people with power rarely understand. The injury is not only what they say. It is how long their certainty can echo inside someone else. Richard felt that sentence more than he heard it. For a moment he saw the younger Naomi not as a symbol, not as a future executive, not as a narrative correction to his own failure, but as a 22-year-old woman going home after being laughed at by people rich enough to forget the sound of their own voices. The thought stayed with him like a hand at the center of his back. Naomi folded her hands again, and the room seemed to settle around her. So before we talk about saving your fortune, she said, you need to know exactly what it cost me to learn how men like you measure value before they decide a person deserves it. Naomi's words did not rush the room. They settled into it the way evenings settled over the city outside, quietly, with enough patience to change everything without asking permission. Richard sat very still, one hand resting near the untouched folder at the edge of her desk, and felt the old instincts in him searching again for structure, for sequence, for some familiar way to convert discomfort into analysis. But this was not market behavior. It was not something he could reduce to trend lines and percentages and then solve by waiting for the right quarter. This was a human cost, and human costs were always harder for people like him because they refused to stay abstract. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, then stood and walked to the shelf near the black and white photograph. From the second row, she drew a thin cream folder, worn only slightly at the corners, the kind of folder that had been carried through too many waiting rooms and too many years to remain pristine. She returned to the desk and opened it with the same calm care she had shown everything else, then turned one page so he could see it. It was an old commuter rail ticket stub, faded nearly to nothing, the print barely legible under the office lamp. Another page held a laundromat receipt stapled to the corner of a legal pad sheet, filled with handwritten notes in small, disciplined script. Another held a photocopy of a temporary contract badge with Naomi's younger face staring out from beneath harsh fluorescent light, unsmiling, tired, determined. Richard looked from the objects to her. You kept these too? He asked. Naomi rested her fingertips lightly against the folder. Only the ones that reminded me who I was becoming when no one was watching. The sentence moved through him differently than the others had. Less accusation, more gravity. He looked again at the badge, the train stub, the receipt. They were not sentimental scraps. They were evidence. Not of suffering for its own sake, but of continuity. Of distance. Traveled inch by inch instead of granted by surname. Naomi sat down and turned another page. This one held a yellow legal pad sheet with 4 columns drawn by hand. Rent. Groceries. Transit. Loan payment. The numbers were small and careful. A note in the margin read, "Do not miss Friday deposit." Richard stared at the handwriting and felt a flicker of embarrassment, so private and unfamiliar, he almost mistook it for irritation. He had spent more on wine at charity dinners than this page allowed for a month of survival. There was a winter, Naomi said, her voice low and even, when I was working 2 finance contracts and tutoring high school students on Saturdays because one client paid net 60 and the other kept losing my paperwork. She gave the smallest shrug, not self-pitying, simply factual. I learned very quickly which kind of stress wealthy people call character building because they have never had to test how long it lasts. Richard lifted his eyes to her face. She was not looking for sympathy. She would have rejected sympathy the way some people rejected counterfeit bills, instantly and without apology. What she wanted, what she kept asking for in one form or another, was witness. Not admiration. Not absolution. Witness. Did anyone help you? He asked. Naomi's expression shifted almost invisibly, and for the first time that evening something warmer than control moved through her features. Yes, she said. Not the people who had the most power. Usually the people who knew what it cost to keep going. She closed the folder halfway and looked toward the window as if the memory were standing somewhere in the reflection. A woman named Mrs. Alvarez used to run the laundromat on Lenox. She would lock the back door at 9 and still let me sit near the folding tables another 20 minutes if I had spreadsheets to finish and nowhere quiet to go. One night, she brought me a paper cup of coffee and said, "You look like somebody trying not to let the world make you smaller." Naomi's voice remained steady, but the room had changed around it. Richard could almost smell the ghost of detergent and overheated machines, hear quarters turning in metal trays, feel fluorescent light pressing down on a tired winter evening. "What did you say?" he asked. Naomi looked back at him. "Nothing at first. I did not trust kindness yet." She gave a faint breath that was almost a smile. "But I went back every Thursday after that." Richard let his gaze fall to the old receipts again. He understood something then that no balance sheet had ever taught him. The people who kept systems running were often held together by invisible acts of mercy from people whose names never entered the annual letters. Not board chairs. Not founders. Not men like him. A laundromat owner. A bus driver who waited 10 extra seconds. A night security guard who let a young contractor warm her hands over the lobby vent before heading back out into January air. Naomi folded the cream folder closed and kept one hand on top of it, as if sealing the memory in place without hiding it. "That is the part wealth misunderstands most," she said. "It thinks survival comes from scale. Sometimes it comes from one person choosing not to make your life harder than it already is." Richard felt his throat tighten around an answer he did not have. The lamplight caught the edge of the crystal glass beside him, throwing a small bright line across the desk. Outside, the city had gone fully into evening now, towers lit gold and white against the darkening blue. Naomi's eyes held his without hostility, and that somehow made everything more difficult. "So when I tell you I know what collapse reaches first," she said softly, "I do not mean I studied it from a distance. I mean I lived close enough to hear it breathing." Richard did not speak for several seconds. The office felt quieter now, but not emptier. It was the kind of silence that gathered after someone had placed something real on the table and refused to take it back. The cream folder rested beneath Naomi's hand, closed again, while the city beyond the glass moved in ribbons of white and red light, distant and self-absorbed, as if millions of lives were unfolding below without any knowledge that one old wound had just been given language on the 42nd floor. Richard looked at Naomi and saw, with a clarity that unsettled him, that the most powerful thing in the room was not the contracts she controlled or the leverage she held over his family office. It was the fact that she had not let hardship turn her into a caricature of resentment. She remembered everything, and yet she remained precise. That kind of restraint was harder to face than anger. He sat back slowly, the leather chair giving under him with a faint sigh. "I used to think discipline looked one way," he said, more to the room than to her. Naomi did not rush to answer. "Most powerful people do," she said. Richard gave a short, humorless breath. It was not quite a laugh. "I thought it looked like certainty. Control. Distance." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Distance is useful when what you are protecting is yourself." The words landed without sharpness, but they left him nowhere comfortable to stand. He looked down at his hands. The skin across his knuckles seemed thinner than he remembered. Age had a way of revealing the body's accounting whether a man consented or not. "And what does discipline look like to you?" he asked. Naomi leaned back in her chair, the lamplight warming one side of her face, while the other remained touched by the blue of evening. Staying human when a system keeps offering you rewards for becoming less so. Richard lifted his eyes to hers. There it was again, the difference between her kind of power and his. He had spent years mastering rooms by teaching people to anticipate his preferences. Naomi mastered rooms by refusing to let them shrink her values. It was not softness. It was steel with memory. He looked toward the black and white photograph on the wall, the bus stop in the rain, the ordinary people beneath the awning. You build all this, he said quietly, glancing around the office, without forgetting where you started. Naomi followed his gaze for a moment, taking in the books, the binders, the calm order that carried no trace of performance. Forgetting would have made me easier to accept, she said. It also would have made me less useful. Richard felt that sentence settle in a place he had kept untouched for years. He thought of all the men he knew who had climbed by sanding down every inconvenient part of themselves until only ambition remained. He had once considered that maturity. Now it looked more like loss. Naomi opened a different folder, thicker this time, and slid one page across the desk. It was a breakdown of the Whitmore family trust, but not the kind Richard's attorneys usually prepared. This one carried annotations in Naomi's hand, dark ink marking not only numbers and clauses, but consequences. Scholarship fund freeze if liquidity fails. Museum pledge suspended. Support staff severance exposure. Pension-linked vendor delays. Richard stared at the notes, and for a second, he forgot to breathe. She had mapped not only the money, but the people standing under it. This is what I mean by fortune, Naomi said. You keep using the word like it only belongs to balance sheets. Richard read the page again. In his world, fortune had always meant scale, generational insulation, influence, the ability to shape markets, institutions, conversations. But on Naomi's paper it looked different. It looked fragile, human, attached to janitorial contracts and scholarship timelines and payroll cycles, and a widow who might never know why a museum grant vanished from her late husband's community center if the structure collapsed. You traced all of this, he said. Naomi nodded. Of course I did. Her voice remained calm, but there was conviction under it now, unmistakable and bright. Because money is never only money once other people are standing beneath it. Richard pressed his fingertips lightly to the edge of the page. He had spent decades telling himself he understood responsibility because he carried large numbers. But this was something deeper than stewardship as he had practiced it. This was moral architecture. The thought embarrassed him and impressed him in equal measure. And you think I stopped seeing that, he said. Naomi looked at him with the same steady clarity she had held all evening. I think you were trained not to see it unless someone like me forced it back into view. He did not argue. The city glowed around them now, fully awake in the night, the office windows reflecting pieces of both of them into the glass. Richard became aware of how tired he was, not in the ordinary sense, but in the way old beliefs became heavy once they started cracking under their own dishonesty. He looked again at the trust breakdown, at the small handwritten note beside one vendor line. Third-generation family business. Vulnerable within 30 days. The note was so simple it almost undid him. 30 days. That was all it took for a man in his position to call something restructuring while another family called it panic. Naomi folded her hands. When your attorney called, he told me you wanted to preserve the Whitmore legacy. Richard looked up. I do. Naomi held his gaze. Then you need to decide whether legacy means your name surviving or your responsibility surviving. They are not always the same thing. The sentence moved through him with the force of recognition rather than blame. He thought of Daniel, of the board, of his late wife, Eleanor, whose name still sat on foundation plaques across the city, dignified and polished, while the values she had cared about had slowly become ceremonial language in rooms obsessed with protecting control. Richard had once believed he was preserving everything that mattered. Sitting across from Naomi Carter, he began to understand he might only have been preserving himself. Naomi rested one hand lightly on the annotated trust page and drew it back toward her. This is why I took the meeting, she said. Not because you deserve rescue. Not because I forgot what happened. Because too many people who never sat at your table are about to pay for decisions made there. Richard looked at her, at the woman he had once reduced to a type, a category, a dismissal easy enough to forget by dinner. Now she sat across from him holding the map of everything he had failed to notice, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel like the most important person in the room. He felt like the last one to understand what his own fortune had really been made of. Naomi did not speak right away after that. She gathered the annotated trust pages into a neat stack and aligned their corners with a care that felt almost ceremonial, as if she understood that order itself could calm a room on the verge of moral collapse. Richard watched her hands move, steady and exact, and thought of all the times he had mistaken composure in women for compliance, especially when it came wrapped in courtesy. He knew better now, or at least he was beginning to. Outside, the city had deepened into full night. Office towers burned in rectangles of gold and white. The river was no longer visible except as a darker absence between lights. Somewhere below, sirens rose and fell, a reminder that urgency always sounded different when it belonged to other people. Naomi set the papers down and looked at him with the same calm attention she had held all evening. "There is a path forward," she said. Richard felt something in his shoulders tighten and release at the same time. Relief wanted to enter the room too quickly, but Naomi's tone did not allow for that. This was not mercy yet. It was structure. "I assume it comes with conditions," he said. Naomi gave a small nod. "It comes with reality." She opened a final folder, one with a dark blue cover and a tab marked restructuring terms. The title alone carried the cold authority of something already thought through. She turned the first page toward him. "My firm can stabilize the debt exposure, negotiate a controlled unwind of the highest risk vehicles, and preserve the charitable and payroll obligations that are most vulnerable in the next 60 days. Richard looked over the page, his eyes moving across clauses, timelines, and authority transfers. The language was legal, but beneath it he could feel Naomi's hand in the design. Nothing ornamental, nothing wasteful. Every line moved toward accountability. "In exchange," she continued, "you step down from sole decision-making authority over the family office." Richard's gaze lifted. Naomi did not blink. "A temporary measure," he said carefully. "A necessary one," she replied. She tapped the page with one finger. "An independent oversight committee will be installed immediately. Your son will have a seat, but not unilateral control. Neither will you." Richard felt the familiar flare of resistance, old and reflexive. "You are asking me to surrender my own institution." Naomi's expression remained composed. "No, I am asking you to stop calling it yours in the singular." The words landed with such quiet precision that for a second he could only stare at her. The lamp beside the desk cast a warm pool across the papers, but there was nothing warm about what she was requiring. It was not punishment. That would have been easier. Punishment ends. This demanded transformation. Naomi turned another page. "Second, all pending scholarship and community commitments attached to the family trust are to be insulated from executive interference. They remain funded regardless of board dispute." Richard glanced down. There was Eleanor's name in the document, attached to the foundation provisions he had once discussed with his late wife in the gentle light of their kitchen, back when purpose had still felt personal instead of ceremonial. Something shifted in him at the sight of it. Naomi noticed, but did not press. "Third," she said, "the internship program under the Whitmore Foundation will be rebuilt from the ground up." Richard looked at her again. "Rebuilt how?" Naomi folded her hands. "Paid placements only. Transparent advancement criteria. Independent review on hiring and promotion recommendations. Mentorship tied to measurable outcomes, not personality fit. And one more condition." Richard waited. Naomi's gaze stayed level. "The program will reserve a leadership track for candidates from historically excluded communities, including Black women entering finance and policy. Not for optics. For access." The room seemed to narrow around that sentence. Richard could hear the rain beginning again, softer this time, tapping faintly against the window as if the weather itself had returned to listen. He leaned back and let out a slow breath. "You built reform into my rescue." Naomi's eyes held his. "I built responsibility into an institution that has avoided it for too long." Richard looked down at the terms again. Each clause felt less like negotiation and more like a diagnosis written in legal language. He thought of his board, of Daniel, of the inevitable calls, the outrage dressed up as concern, the bruised egos of men who had mistaken proximity to power for entitlement. A few months ago, he would have fought to preserve the old structure simply because it was old and his. Tonight, that instinct felt smaller, almost adolescent. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Naomi did not answer immediately. She turned the crystal glass a fraction with her fingertips, watching the lamplight catch the rim. "Then the creditors move faster," she said. "The internal fractures widen. The public version becomes ugly. The private version becomes irreversible. And the people least responsible start paying first." Richard closed his eyes for one brief second. He saw scholarship letters not sent. Staff layoffs explained in language polished enough to sound strategic. Daniel trying to prove strength by repeating the worst parts of him. He saw Eleanor's name on plaques while the values beneath it quietly hollowed out. When he opened his eyes again, Naomi was still there, still patient, still unwavering. She had not raised her voice once all evening. She had not humiliated him. She had simply arranged the truth until it was impossible to look away. "You knew I would hate these terms," he said. Naomi's face softened by the smallest measure. Enough to register as humanity, not indulgence. "I knew you would recognize them." Richard stared at her for a long moment, then lowered his gaze to the signature lines waiting at the bottom of the page. The pen resting beside the folder was black lacquer, understated, expensive, the kind of pen men like him had always used to formalize power. Tonight it looked different. Less like authority, more like a test. Naomi spoke one final time, her voice low and perfectly steady. "This is the part where you decide whether saving your fortune matters more than saving the version of yourself that created this mess." Richard looked at the pen for a long time without touching it. The office had become so quiet that even the soft hum of the air vents seemed deliberate, like the building itself was holding still to see what kind of man would remain when no audience was left to impress. Naomi sat across from him, her hands resting lightly on the folder, not pressing, not retreating, leaving the decision exactly where it belonged. There was no triumph in her face, no hunger for the spectacle of his surrender. That absence unsettled him more than any performance of power could have. It meant this moment was not about her winning. It was about whether he was still capable of telling the truth about himself when it finally cost him something. Richard lifted the pen at last, then set it back down without signing. "You are asking me to dismantle the habits that built everything I know," he said. Naomi's gaze did not leave his. "No," she replied. "I am asking you to stop confusing habits with wisdom." He exhaled slowly, the breath catching somewhere in the center of his chest. The words should have sounded rehearsed, the kind of elegant line a younger executive might use to perform moral superiority. But nothing about Naomi felt rehearsed. She had earned every sentence the hard way, and he knew it. He turned his head toward the window. Rain moved over the glass in fine dark threads now, blurring the office towers across the avenue into columns of gold and shadow. In the reflection, he could see himself only faintly. A silver-haired man in an expensive suit, shoulders slightly bent. A figure who had spent decades becoming formidable and had somehow arrived here looking smaller than the woman. Seated across from him, he thought of Eleanor, not in the grand public way people remembered her now, with foundation speeches and framed photographs and her name etched into polished stone, but in the private way memory kept the real dead alive. Eleanor at their kitchen counter in socks on a cold morning, reading scholarship letters with her coffee going untouched. Eleanor saying, years ago, that the real test of wealth was whether it expanded dignity or merely purchased insulation. He had nodded then, half listening, already late for a call, assuming there would be endless years to understand her better. Time had corrected that assumption. Richard looked down again at the terms Naomi had drafted. Scholarship protection, independent oversight, leadership pathways for people his institutions had too often left waiting outside the right rooms. It was not charity. That was the striking thing. Naomi was not asking for sentiment. She was structuring fairness the way he had once structured control. "Daniel will resist this," he said quietly. Naomi gave a small nod. "Probably. The board will call it capitulation. They can call it whatever helps them survive hearing the truth." Richard almost smiled again, but grief moved through the impulse before it could become expression. "You do not make this easy." Naomi's voice softened just slightly. "It was never easy for me either." The sentence stayed with him. Not dramatic, not angry, simply placed in the room like a hand turning over a final card. Richard understood then that he had been waiting all evening for permission to believe this was still about power in the old sense, that he could choose pride and still imagine it was principle. But Naomi had denied him that refuge. She had named the people beneath the structure, named the habits beneath the language, named the human cost beneath the fortune. And now the choice was stripped down to something embarrassingly plain. Preserve the shell of his authority, or protect what remained worth inheriting. He picked up the pen again. His hand was steady now, or steadier than he expected. He signed the first line, then the second. Then each page Naomi turned toward him with the quiet rhythm of a man no longer pretending the old version of himself deserved to be preserved intact. The ink looked darker than it should have under the lamp, each signature both familiar and strange, as if his name meant something different when it was no longer being used to defend his own reflection. When he finished, he placed the pen carefully on the desk and sat back. Naomi did not reach for the papers right away. She looked at him for one long, unreadable moment, and in that silence Richard realized what had changed. He did not feel humiliated. Exposed, yes. Tired, certainly. But not humiliated. Naomi had not taken his dignity from him. She had asked him to stop using it as a shield against responsibility. She gathered the signed documents into a neat stack and rested her palm on top of them. "The team will begin tonight," she said. Richard nodded once. His voice, when it came, was lower than usual. "I should have heard you the first time." Naomi looked at him, and for the first time that evening something in her expression gave way, not into softness exactly, but into the smallest visible form of mercy. "Yes," she said. Then she rose from her chair, moved to the window, and stood looking out at the rain-lit city below. Richard followed her with his eyes, not because he wanted her forgiveness, but because he finally understood the scale of what she had chosen not to become. She could have made him small tonight. She had every reason. Instead, she had made the room larger than his ego, larger than his fear, larger even than the old wound that had brought them here. In the glass, her reflection stood clear against the city lights, steady and self-possessed, and Richard felt a truth move through him with the quiet force of something that had been waiting years to be admitted. He had once mocked a young woman for believing money could carry moral weight. Now the only reason his world still had a future was that she had never stopped believing it. Naomi stayed by the window for a few seconds after Richard signed, one hand resting lightly against the frame, her reflection suspended in the glass above the wet glitter of the city. Behind her, the desk lamp cast a warm circle over the signed pages, making the black ink look newly alive. The room no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like the quiet after a decision that would take years to understand fully. Richard remained seated, his hands now empty, on the arms of the chair, and he noticed the strange lightness that sometimes followed surrender when surrender had finally stopped being defeat and become clarity instead. Naomi turned back at last and crossed to the desk, gathering the documents into a leather portfolio with the same careful economy that had marked every gesture she made. Then she pressed a button on the small console near her phone. "Maya, please have legal begin implementation and bring in the operations packet." Her voice was steady, practical, almost ordinary. No ceremonial emphasis. No pause to savor what had happened. Power, Richard realized, looked very different when it was not hungry to be admired. A moment later, the office door opened and a young woman in a navy dress stepped in carrying a slim box file and a tablet. She could not have been more than 24. Her hair was braided neatly back from her face, and there was a kind of held-breath determination in the way she walked, as if she had taught herself to move through important rooms without taking up more space than necessary. Richard saw it instantly because he had spent so many years benefiting from not having to notice it. "This is Maya Brooks," Naomi said. "She runs transition analysis for me." Maya set the file on the desk with careful hands. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Her voice was calm, professional, but Richard caught the smallest edge of caution under it, the kind that came from learning early that some men could make a room colder just by deciding you had not earned your place in it. "Good evening," he said. The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth, not because they were polite, but because for the first time in a very long while he was paying attention to how politeness could either acknowledge a person or erase them. Maya handed Naomi the tablet and opened the box file to a color-coded implementation schedule. Naomi scanned it, then angled the first page toward Richard. These are the immediate protections, she said. Payroll continuity, vendor stabilization, scholarship insulation, communications freeze until the oversight committee is installed. Richard looked over the schedule, but his attention kept drifting back to Maya, to the disciplined stillness in her posture, to the way she stood just slightly behind the edge of the chair rather than beside it, as if experience had taught her where discomfort was least likely to find her. He wondered how many times in his own offices people like her had made themselves smaller in order to remain unthreatening to someone else's ego. Naomi began discussing timelines with Maya, and the dynamic between them was so seamless it took Richard a moment to understand why. Naomi did not perform mentorship. She practiced it. She asked questions without condescension. She listened without making listening look generous. When Maya pointed out a sequencing risk in the scholarship disbursement memo, Naomi did not correct her in front of him or soften the point into something safer. She nodded once and said, "Good catch. Move that ahead of the board notice." Maya made the note, and something in her shoulders eased almost invisibly. Richard felt the shift like a small light turning on in a room he had once helped keep dim. He looked at Naomi, then back at Maya. "How long have you been with the firm?" he asked. Maya glanced briefly at Naomi, then answered, 2 years, sir." Naomi closed the portfolio and set it aside. "She joined right out of graduate school," she said. "Top of her class. Brilliant under pressure." Maya lowered her eyes for 1 second, not out of embarrassment exactly, but from the unfamiliarity of being praised in front of power without the praise being turned into a test. Richard recognized that too, and the recognition made something ache. He thought of the intern lists Naomi had shown him, the exit notes, the vanished names, the bright young people his institutions had treated as provisional. How many Mayas had come and gone while men like him congratulated themselves on pipeline initiatives and inclusive language. Naomi continued outlining next steps, but Richard only half heard her. His mind had gone somewhere else, back to an old conference room, to a younger version of Naomi holding a clicker and notes, trying to speak an idea into a room that had already decided her value before she began. And here she was now, not just successful, but building the kind of room that would have saved the younger version of herself years of quiet erosion. Maya finished the update and gathered the extra pages into a neat stack. "Legal is standing by," she said. "Communications can be contained until morning." Naomi nodded. "Thank you, Maya." As Maya turned to leave, Naomi added, "And send me your comments on the internship framework before 8. I want your revisions in the first draft." Maya blinked, surprised. "Mine?" Naomi's expression softened by the slightest degree. "Yes, yours." Something warm and startled moved across Maya's face before she recovered it into professionalism. "I will," she said. After the door closed behind her, the office seemed different again, not heavier, but fuller somehow. Richard looked at Naomi across the desk. "She reminds me of you," he said quietly. Naomi held his gaze. "That is exactly why she will not have my beginning." The sentence stayed in the air with a kind of quiet brightness. Richard looked toward the door Maya had just passed through and understood, more deeply than before, that this was the real reversal. Not that Naomi had reached the top of a structure that once dismissed her. It was that she had refused to let success turn into imitation. She had built a future where the next young black woman in the room would not have to rehearse her face before speaking. And somehow that felt larger than saving his fortune, larger even than the signed documents on the desk. It felt like the first honest definition of legacy he had heard all night. Richard stood only after the room had fully settled again. The chair eased back with a faint whisper against the rug, and for a second he simply remained where he was, one hand resting on the edge of Naomi's desk, as if he needed the contact to steady the strange recalibration happening somewhere below thought. The office had taken on that late-night stillness particular to Manhattan towers after most assistants had gone home, and only the committed or the cornered remained under the lights. Beyond the glass, the city shimmered in long vertical bands, every window another life, another negotiation, another quiet exhaustion being carried through the dark. Naomi closed the last portfolio and set it aside. The movement was small, but it felt final. No music, no speech, just paper aligned, decisions made, consequences set in motion. Richard looked at her and felt the full distance between the first time they had sat across from each other and now. Not just the years, The moral distance. The kind measured less by promotions and headlines than by who each of them had become when tested by power. I should go, he said, though the words sounded incomplete the moment they left him. Naomi gave a slight nod. My team will contact your office before 7 in the morning. Richard almost said thank you out of reflex, the polished phrase men like him used whenever they wanted gratitude to tidy a room they had complicated. But gratitude was too small for what had happened here, and politeness too thin. He looked toward the black and white photograph again, the bus stop in the rain, the ordinary people waiting under a narrow awning with nowhere glamorous to be and nowhere else to hide from the weather. Eleanor used to say that decency is easiest to admire from a distance, he said quietly. Naomi watched him without interruption. She used to say the harder thing was letting it rearrange you. Naomi's expression changed almost imperceptibly at the mention of his wife. Not softer exactly. More attentive. Richard let out a breath and gave the smallest shake of his head. I spent years thinking success had confirmed my instincts. He looked down at his hands, then back up. Maybe it only insulated them. The room stayed still after that. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She seemed to understand that some truths could only arrive if they were allowed to feel slightly unfinished in the mouth. Richard moved toward the window, stopping a few feet away from her, both of them facing the city for a moment rather than each other. The glass held their reflections side by side, his silvered and tired, hers composed and luminous under the lamp glow. He thought of Maya, of the interns who had vanished from his old reports as cleanly as if ambition itself had an expiration date, of Naomi at 22, rehearsing a face in fluorescent light so that men like him would find her easier to tolerate. The shame in that thought was quiet, but it was no longer avoidable. I cannot undo what I said to you, he said. Naomi kept her eyes on the city. No, she replied. You cannot. There was no cruelty in it. Only truth. Richard nodded once. He found that he preferred truth now, even when it left marks. But I can stop pretending it did not matter. Naomi turned then, and the light caught the gold at her wrist and the calm steadiness in her face. That matters more than most people think, she said. Richard met her gaze. Will it be enough? Naomi considered him for a second, and he could see that she took the question seriously, which was its own form of mercy. Enough is not a clean line, she said. Some things heal in policy, some in practice, some only in how the next person is treated when they enter the room. Richard let that settle. Somewhere below, traffic rolled through the wet streets in muted ribbons of sound. A helicopter blinked red over the river and vanished into the dark. The city kept moving, indifferent to private reckonings, which somehow made this one feel more honest. He reached into his inside pocket and took out a business card, then looked at it for a moment before setting it back. Old habits, old symbols, useless now. Daniel will call this weakness, he said. Naomi's mouth shifted by the faintest fraction, almost a smile, but steadier than that. Then perhaps he still has something to learn about strength. Richard gave a quiet breath that held more weariness than amusement. He learned too much from me. Then teach him something different next. The sentence landed gently, but it went deeper than anything else had tonight. Richard stood with it for a moment, feeling its weight, its possibility, its accusation, all without ornament. Then he nodded, not because he had mastered it already, but because for once he understood the assignment before failing it. Naomi walked him to the door, not out of deference, not as a performance of class, but with the same simple self-possession that had marked everything she did. When she opened it, the corridor beyond lay quiet and softly lit, the polished floor reflecting warm pools from the sconces. Richard paused on the threshold and turned back. There were many things he could have said then, many elegant sentences available to a man educated in the language of damage control and delayed sincerity. None of them felt clean enough. Naomi saved him from reaching for one. We start at 7, she said. Richard nodded again. I will be ready. He stepped into the corridor, and the door closed softly behind him. He stood there for a moment alone, listening to the hush of the building, the distant elevator chime, the low mechanical heartbeat of wealth and glass and climate control. Then he looked through the narrow strip of frosted glass one last time. Naomi had already returned to her desk. She was not watching him leave. She was reviewing the next file under the warm circle of the lamp, fully inside the future she had built with hands the world had once underestimated. Richard turned and walked toward the elevator, slower than he had arrived, his reflection keeping pace beside him in the darkened windows. Down on the street, rain would still be clinging to the sidewalks, taxi roofs shining yellow under the lights, people hurrying home with collars up and grocery bags in hand, carrying their own small fortunes of rent money and bus fare and tomorrow's hope. For the first time in years, he understood that power had never made him larger. It had only made it easier not to notice other people's gravity. And somewhere behind him, in an office above the wet, bright city, a woman he had once dismissed was not just saving his fortune. She was teaching him, far too late and exactly on time, what it meant to deserve one. At 6:58 the next morning, Richard Whitmore was already seated at the long conference table in the Whitmore family office, though he had barely slept and had not touched the coffee cooling near his right hand. Morning light slid in through the east-facing windows in pale strips, clean and indifferent, catching dust above the polished wood and the silver threads at his temples. The room smelled faintly of roasted beans, printer heat, and the citrus polish the housekeeping staff used before dawn. Around him, the architecture of old certainty remained exactly as it had always been. The framed photographs, the commissioned abstracts, the discreet leather blotters at every seat. The invisible hierarchy built into who sat where and who spoke first. Only this morning, for the first time in years, Richard could see the room as a machine rather than a home. He heard voices in the corridor before the door opened, quick and low. Then Naomi Carter entered with Maya Brooks and two members of her legal team, carrying slim portfolios and a kind of focused calm that made everyone already inside sit a little straighter. No one announced her. She did not need announcing. Her authority entered with her the way daylight did, not asking permission from the furniture. Richard rose, and, after the smallest pause, so did everyone else. Naomi acknowledged the room with one measured glance, then took the seat midway down the table rather than at the head. Richard noticed it instantly. Old reflexes had taught him that power always rushed to occupy the center. Naomi had no need. The room reorganized around her anyway. Daniel Whitmore arrived 30 seconds later, sharp suit, restless jaw, impatience moving ahead of him like static. He stopped when he saw Naomi, then looked at Richard. What is this? Richard could feel every eye in the room shift between father and son, waiting to see which version of leadership would appear first. Naomi opened her folder without looking rattled. This is the implementation meeting, she said. The stabilization plan begins today. Daniel gave a short laugh that carried no amusement. You brought in outside control without clearing it with the board? Richard heard in his son's tone an echo of himself from years ago, the same polished disbelief that assumed authority had already settled the question before anyone else spoke. For one brief second, he understood how exhausting he must have been to people who had not been born protected by his surname. Naomi placed a summary packet in front of Daniel. Your father signed the restructuring terms last night. Daniel did not sit. Last night. His eyes went to Richard. You did this without consulting me? Richard looked at the paper in front of him before answering, not because he was unsure, but because he wanted to say the next sentence without the old armor wrapped around it. I did it because consultation has too often been how this family delayed responsibility. The words altered the air. Daniel stared at him as if the wrong man had spoken. Across the table, Naomi said nothing. She did not need to rescue Richard from his own sentence. She had already done something more difficult than rescue. She had returned him to himself without the excuses. Daniel dropped into a chair at last, anger sharpening his movements. This is a takeover. Naomi folded her hands. No, it is an interruption. Daniel looked at her with the quick contempt of a man too accustomed to rooms tilting in his favor. And who exactly are you to interrupt this family? The question hit the table and stayed there. No one moved. Maya's pen paused above her notes. One of the attorneys glanced down. Morning light brightened against the glass. Richard felt the old instinct, the one that used to let comments like that slide past in the name of keeping the meeting moving, of not making things awkward, of preserving the comfort of people who had never had to earn it. That instinct had built far too much of the room they were sitting in. Before Naomi could answer, Richard spoke. She is the reason this family still has a chance to keep what matters. Daniel turned to him, stunned. Richard held his son's gaze. And if you cannot hear her without needing to diminish her first, then you are proving exactly why this intervention is necessary. Silence followed, deeper than surprise. Naomi remained very still, but Richard noticed the smallest shift in her face. Not gratitude, not triumph, something more careful than either. Recognition, perhaps, or the sober understanding that truth spoken late still mattered when it changed the temperature of a room. Daniel looked from his father to Naomi and back again, trying to locate the familiar geometry of power and failing. Richard could almost see the moment it happened, the instant his son realized this was not a tactical concession that could be mocked into retreat. It was a realignment. Naomi turned one page in the packet and spoke in the same, even tone she had used the night before. The scholarship protections are already in motion. Payroll continuity is secured. The oversight committee will be installed by noon. Your seat remains, Mr. Whitmore, if you can operate within the terms. Daniel stared at the page, but did not touch it. Richard watched his son struggle with the same thing he had struggled with hours earlier, the shrinking world of old entitlement when it finally met a person who would not bend to it. The difference was that Naomi did not press him, did not humiliate him, did not return insult for insult. She simply kept the structure visible until everyone in the room had to decide what kind of people they were inside it. Sunlight moved another inch across the table, catching the edge of Naomi's watch, the black lacquer pen near Richard's hand, the rows of briefing papers that would, by afternoon, begin changing the shape of the Whitmore name. Richard looked around the room he had once mistaken for proof of his own rightness and saw something he had never seen clearly before. Power was not the ability to silence discomfort. It was the willingness to let truth remain in the room long enough to reorder it. Daniel lowered himself further into the chair, anger not gone but forced now into the discipline of listening. Naomi began outlining the first 90 days, each sentence clean and steady, while Maya moved through the schedules with quiet confidence, no longer standing at the edge of the moment, but inside it. Richard listened, not as a man being overruled, but as one being taught, line by line, what stewardship should have sounded like all along. And as the morning light continued to spread over the polished wood, he understood that this was what repair looked like at the beginning. Not applause, not redemption wrapped neat. Just one room, finally told to become more honest than the people who built it. By late afternoon, the building had settled into a different rhythm. The sharp urgency of the morning had softened into the steady pulse of implementation. Phones ringing in shorter bursts, printers feeding out documents that no longer described a crisis, but the architecture of a response. In the Whitmore family office, sunlight had shifted from pale gold to a deeper amber, stretching long across the conference table and climbing the wall of framed photographs until even the old images looked as if they were being asked to explain themselves. Richard Whitmore stood alone near the window with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled once at the wrist, something no one in this office had seen him do during a formal meeting in years. Below, the city moved through the bright, cold clarity of a fall afternoon, cabs streaming downtown, pedestrians crossing in dense waves, the river catching flashes of sun like torn silver. Behind him, the room was quieter now. Daniel had left an hour earlier, subdued in a way Richard had never seen before, not defeated exactly, but unsettled by a kind of authority he had not been taught how to challenge. The legal teams had moved to adjoining offices. Maya was in the smaller conference room reviewing the revised internship framework with operations. Naomi remained at the far end of the table, reading through the final scholarship insulation memo under a pool of natural light. There was nothing theatrical about her presence, no attempt to mark the day as a triumph. She worked the same way she had spoken, calmly, precisely, giving the future its proper paperwork. Richard turned from the window and looked at her for a long moment. The office around them felt both familiar and newly strange, as if the same walls had been made to hold a different ethic simply by insisting on one. He crossed back to the table slowly. Naomi sensed him approach and looked up from the memo. The museum grant has been secured through the next 2 fiscal years, she said. The community center disbursements will not be interrupted. Richard nodded. He could hear Eleanor's voice in that outcome more clearly than in any plaque. She would have liked that, he said. Naomi held his gaze. I think she would have asked why it was ever at risk. Richard let out a quiet breath, something between acceptance and regret. She would have asked that too. Naomi set the memo down and closed the folder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The late sun warmed the edge of the wood between them, catching dust in the air so fine it looked like memory made visible. From the smaller conference room came the faint murmur of voices, then Maya's laugh, quick and surprised, followed by the rustle of pages turning. The sound reached both of them. Naomi glanced toward the door, and something gentle passed across her face. Richard heard it too, and felt the room shift around that small bright noise. Not because it erased anything, because it proved something had already begun changing. He looked at Naomi. "You were right," he said. The sentence came without ornament. About legacy. About responsibility. About all the things I called strength because I was afraid to examine what they cost other people. Naomi did not interrupt. Richard rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair, the leather cool beneath his fingers. "For years I thought the worst thing that could happen to a man like me was losing control." He glanced toward the window again, toward the city that kept moving whether his pride survived the day or not. "It never occurred to me that keeping control at all costs was how I was losing everything worth passing on." Naomi listened with that same steady stillness that had carried the entire day, and Richard understood now that her restraint had never been silence. It had been discipline in service of something larger than personal vindication. "I cannot repair the years behind us," he said, "but I can decide what happens in the rooms that still carry my name." Naomi's eyes stayed on him, level and unreadable for 1 second, then softened by the smallest degree. "That is where repair starts," she said. The late sun caught the gold at her wrist as she gathered the finished folder and rose from her chair. She moved toward the window, standing a few feet away, both of them looking out now at the city below. The glass threw back a faint reflection of them side by side. The aging patriarch and the woman he had once dismissed, their outlines held for a moment against towers of light and strips of sky, turning slowly toward evening. "When I was younger," Naomi said quietly, "I thought being seen would be enough." Richard turned his head slightly toward her, but did not speak. "Then I learned that being seen by the wrong people can still leave you unseen." Her voice remained calm, but there was a softer current under it now, not heard exactly, but the memory of having carried it. What mattered in the end was building places where other people would not have to spend half their talent proving they belonged before they could use the rest of it. Richard looked at her reflection in the glass. "You did that." Naomi gave a small shake of her head. "I started it. People like Maya will decide whether it lasts." The answer felt right to him in a way the old answers never had. No single savior. No grand self-mythology. Just stewardship passed hand to hand, or lost. From the hallway came the soft ding of an elevator and the murmur of someone saying goodnight. The day was beginning to fold itself closed. Richard looked down at the street. Far below, a woman in a red coat stood at the curb holding the hand of a little boy in a backpack too large for his frame. They waited for the light to change while traffic rushed past in bright, indifferent streams. When the walk signal flashed, they stepped forward together. Such a small thing. Such an ordinary thing. And yet for some reason it pressed against his chest harder than the signed documents had. Perhaps because it reminded him how many lives moved beneath the consequences of rooms like his. How much of fortune was simply whether tomorrow arrived with dignity intact. He turned back toward Naomi. "There is one more thing," he said. She waited. "The internship program should not carry my family name anymore." Naomi studied him for a moment, and this time the surprise in her face was visible. Richard continued before he could retreat from the instinct. "Not because I want distance from it. Because I want honesty. Let it be named for Eleanor. She understood its purpose better than I ever did." Naomi looked at him for a long second, then nodded once. "All right. Nothing grand. Just 2 words." But they landed with the calm finality of a door opening inward. The sun lowered another inch, and the room filled with that last thin burnished light that made edges glow before evening took them back. Maya appeared in the doorway then, tablet in hand, her expression bright with concentration. "The revised framework is ready," she said, then paused, sensing the stillness in the room. Naomi turned and smiled at her, small but unmistakably real. "Bring it in," she said. Maya crossed to the table and set the tablet down between them. Richard looked at the document on the screen. New criteria. Transparent pathways. Paid placements. Independent review. Mentorship measured by growth, not comfort. At the top, Where a placeholder name had been, Maya had typed Eleanor Initiative for Emerging Leaders. Richard felt something tighten in his throat, then ease. Naomi glanced at the screen, then at him. It fits, she said. Richard nodded once, because speaking felt unnecessary. Outside, the sky over Manhattan had begun turning the color of cooled steel, and the first evening lights were waking across the avenue. Inside, 3 people stood around a table that had seen too much certainty and not enough conscience, and together they were rewriting what the room would ask of the next person who entered it. No applause marked the moment. No camera would have known where to look. There was only the soft hum of the building, the glow of the tablet screen, the fading sun on polished wood, and the quiet knowledge that some reversals do not end with someone being crushed. They end with someone choosing not to repeat the shape of what once hurt them. Richard looked at Naomi one last time in that light, and understood with an almost painful clarity that this was the real fortune she now controlled. Not merely the trusts and vehicles and signatures. Something rarer. The moral direction of what came next. He had laughed at her dream when it cost him nothing. Years later, she had held his future in her hands and answered not with revenge, but with structure, memory, and grace strong enough to outlast his pride. And as the city darkened around them and the office windows turned to mirrors, it became clear that she had not simply saved a family fortune. She had taught the people inside it how to become human enough to deserve one.